Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.
Hello and welcome to our podcast here at YPEC. The summer of 2023 is almost over, so today we will analyze what's happened during the last 2 to 3 months in and around the war in Ukraine. For that, I welcome, as always, Professor Gerhard Mangold, political scientist at the University of Innsbruck. Good morning.
Good morning.
It seems that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is finally getting traction. Last weekend, there were news of a major breakthrough near Verbove in the south, so they can subsequently reach the important supply hub of Tokmak. How is the overall situation and how much time does the Ukraine have approximately before the autumn weather is kicking in?
Well, the Ukrainian offensive started at the beginning of June, and for a very long time it seemed that Ukraine will not be able to reach the ambitious goals of taking the city of Melitopol in the region of Zaporizhia and move further on to the coast of the Azov Sea. But in the last 3 weeks, Ukraine has made some territorial gains, has broken through a Russian defense line at the villages of Robotine and now Verbovie. So the gains that the Ukrainian army is making is encouraging for the Ukrainian side. So it's too early to say, as some have done in the past, that the summer offensive of Ukraine has failed. What is to add more is that besides the gains at the front lines, the Ukrainian army has been able to destroy very high value targets of the Russian army far behind the front lines, particularly on the peninsula of Crimea. So Ukraine has destroyed logistical hubs. It has destroyed supply lines, weapons depots, fuel depots, and as everybody knows, a couple of days ago, they destroyed the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with a lot of casualties resulting of this attack. So yes, some incremental gains at the front line, but very serious gains behind the lines in the backward of the war area by destroying these mentioned Russian high-value targets.
When does usually set the autumn weather in Ukraine? Can you tell? Can we say like in mid-October and October usually,
well,
where there's no chance for warfare anymore then?
Well, it will still take about 4 weeks. Could be longer, depending on the weather, of course. But if the heavy rains start and the surface gets muddy, it is of course more difficult to move on with not just with the infantry, but more importantly with the heavy hardware that Ukraine has gained from Western countries, armed vehicles, tanks, of course, and so this and heavy artillery. So when this Rasputitsa sets in and the surface gets muddy, it will definitely mean that the onward march of the Ukrainian army will be more difficult and will slow down. When this Rasputitsa is over and the surface gets frozen, then the Ukrainian army has pledged and the Ukrainian leadership has pledged to continue with its offensive over the winter. Let's see how this works out, but this is at least the announced ambition of the Ukrainian side.
Last time when we spoke, we talked about Yevgeny Prigozhin and the mutiny of the Wagner Group. And now, several weeks ago, the airplane of Yevgeny Prigozhin crashed, or rather was crashed, as everyone outside of Russia expects. How did this event affect Putin's position within Russia? Is he stronger now as one of the threats to his power is gone? Or is he weaker, as he probably angered also a lot of people, especially within the army, with killing one of the few Russian heroes of this war?
Well, I would say that the position of Vladimir Putin in the governing elite in Russia has been strengthened by the killing of Prigozhin and other leaders of the group Wagner in August of this year. You know, the mutiny on June the 23rd has indicated that Putin has had a partial loss of control. The mutiny itself was the consequence of failing leadership by Vladimir Putin, and this made him look rather weak. And already on the day of the mutiny, I told television media that if Putin doesn't want to continue to look weak, he needs to liquidate Prigozhin. And I think this is what happened 2 months later. So Prigozhin is out. Putin's position that traitors need to be punished has been implemented again. Putin had been asked in 2018 in a television interview if he could forgive certain deeds, and he said yes, but not one deed, namely treason. And obviously, in the case of Prigozhin, he actually made true what he had announced in that interview. It's also been a sign to the other members of the Russian elite, telling them, showing them that if you actually try to weaken my position, if you oppose my policy lines, then I can take you out, meaning I can actually really kill you. And that is also a message we need to take into account that has been sent by the killing of Prigozhin. However, this new stability of Putin's position can evaporate quite quickly if the war goes on in Ukraine in a disastrous manner for the Russian side. But for now, at least, I think that Putin has made clear that he is in control and nobody can actually oppose him without being punished.
What can we make of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un and the promised military support provided by North Korea? Will it have a real impact on the war? And what does it mean for the diplomatic isolation of Kim?
Well, you know, the relationship between Russia and North Korea is completely transactional. So it means that North Korea has something to offer, Russia has something to offer. Both need what the other side can give, and so that's why they have most likely found an arrangement when North Korea supplies artillery munitions and shells to the Russian side. We don't know if this has been decided. We don't know how many, if the answer is yes, of artillery munitions will be sent by North Korea to Russia. It can be said, of course, that these weapons will not be a game changer in the war, but it can stabilize Russian artillery positions and the use of Russian artillery. On the other hand, North Korea is asking not just for supplies of food and energy, but would also like to have Russian support in bringing a military spy satellite into the orbit. North Korea has tried twice over the past months. Both efforts have failed, so now North Korea wants to have a successful launch, and Russia can perfectly help with that. It's always been speculated that Russia would also support the North Korean army in its submarine strategy, providing nuclear-propelled submarines, but I don't think this is very likely. This is something that Russia would not like to offer to Ukraine. If Russia does help, sorry, not Ukraine, but North Korea. If Russia does support North Korea militarily, we need to take into account that all military transactions with North Korea are forbidden by United Nations sanctions. The Russian president has stated publicly that, of course, Russia will abide by all these sanctions, but if they would abide, as he pledges, then, of course, no military deals would be possible. So I do think that Russia will violate these United Nations sanctions.
Is this maybe also a backdoor for Chinese weaponry going to Russia via North Korea?
I don't think so. It has been the case that China has delivered non-lethal military goods to the Russian army But as far as we know, China has not supplied any lethal military hardware to the Russians. The Chinese leadership obviously is afraid of US or Western sanctions imposed on Chinese private and state companies if China would decide to deliver weapons to the Russian side. So I don't think that China will deliver weapons to North Korea, then North Korea hands them over to the Russian side. It can't be ruled out, of course, but I don't think it's very likely.
A few days ago, there has been a major disagreement between Poland and Ukraine over the Zelensky speech at the United Nations and the Ukrainian grain transports. Did the initial harsh reaction out of Warsaw have to do only with the upcoming political election, or are there deeper roots for this disagreement?
Of course, parliamentary elections on October 15th play a role. Of course, the governing party, Peace, Law and Justice, has an interest to gain as many votes as possible, particularly gaining votes that could have been lost to a far-right political party in Poland. And of course, this ruling party, Peace, needs the support of the Polish farmers. So yes, this decision by Poland, like the decision by the Hungarian government, has been a reaction to the oversupply of Ukrainian grain to these national markets. But in the case of Poland, also with the elections that will take place in a couple of weeks. Still, the tone that was used between the two capitals was surprising. Not so much the Polish wording, but that Ukraine actually responded to the decision by Poland and Hungary to prohibit grain imports from Ukraine by telling them Ukraine would sue them at the World Trade Organization was indeed surprising, because Poland, not Hungary, but Poland has been a very staunch supporter of the Ukrainian side, and Poland has also tried to put pressure on other Western governments to deliver more and more complex weaponry. So Polish support has been very, very strong. In addition, Poland has taken in a lot of Ukrainian refugees. So it was surprising that the Ukrainian side immediately responded with this threat to bring Poland before the WTO court. And I think that Ukraine needs to take care that its public wordings and its demands do not overstretch Western patience and Western readiness to support Ukraine. Already at the NATO Vilnius summit in July of this year, the former British Prime Minister Ben Wallace said, confronted with demands by the Ukrainian side for more weaponry, by saying, we are not Amazon.
Okay. Several weeks ago at the G20 summit in India, the participants couldn't find common ground in condemning the Russian attack on Ukraine. In fact, it was said that it was quite a heated debate before the final declaration was published. So how united is the world really against Russia?
Well, there's no global isolation of Russia. Of course, Russia is isolated politically and diplomatically by all Western countries, the global West, so to speak. And I think this isolation will not be over as long as Putin will stay in power as Russian president. But globally, Russia is not isolated. We have had several countries who have not condemned the Russian invasion. We have only 46 countries out of 193 United Nations members who have imposed sanctions on Russia. Only a few countries have really sided with the Russian position, countries like Eritrea or Syria or Cuba, Venezuela, or China and India. But as the latter two are concerned, they have not actually voted with Russia when the General Assembly of the United Nations passed resolutions with a huge majority condemning the Russian invasion. It has spoken out and said it wants to end this war as quickly as possible, but India and China have not condemned the invasion, and actually are helping Russia very much to mitigate the impact of Western sanctions by actually increasing the trade, the foreign trade the countries have with Russia. So no, Russia is not isolated globally. And in addition, I'd like to say it is not what the American framing has been so far. Namely, what we see in Ukraine is a confrontation between democracies and autocracies. I don't think that this is true. Of course, Russia is a dictatorship, China is a dictatorship, no question about that. But what I see here is not an ideological confrontation between democracies and autocracies, but it's a great power rivalry. And all this talk about this ideological confrontation, I think, is only a propaganda play, understandably so, but still it's propaganda. And we also have to say that in the confrontation with Russia and other non-Western countries, the Western democracies also rely on heavy-handed dictatorships like the one in Azerbaijan or Saudi Arabia or Vietnam and some other places. So no, I don't think it's this ideological confrontation between democracies on one side and autocracies on the other side. It's great power rivalry.
In the United States, the primary campaigns for the presidential elections next year have started, and it seems that most Republican candidates are not willing to support Ukraine's efforts of self-defense as extensive as the current administration does, as we have just seen when President Zelensky visited the United States. What do you take of that topic, and how much pressure does this put on Ukrainians to show some success in their offensives until the election in November 2024?
Well, it seems that the mood in Washington has changed considerably. It is Republican presidential candidates dominating the opinion polls who argue that the United States should not provide any more funding to Ukraine, no military assistance, no economic and financial assistance, and no humanitarian assistance. And according to some polls, a majority of the United States people is opposing further aid to Ukraine. Allegedly 55% are opposing it. But what is more relevant, more than 80% of Republican voters don't want to see any more funding for Ukraine by the US government. And of course, this is the voter base for the Republican presidential candidates. And so they are responding to a certain extent to the mood among the Republican voters. What is more, in the United States House of Representatives, where the Republicans hold a majority, a very thin majority, a minority of the Republican deputies, the so-called Freedom Caucus, a right-wing faction of the Republican Party, is clearly opposing any more funding. It's not very likely that a bill presented to the House of Representatives providing more aid to Ukraine, and President Biden has asked for $24 billion more in military and economic funding of Ukraine. It's not likely that such a proposal would be rejected by a majority of the House Representatives, but it will definitely divide the Republican faction. Namely, it will most likely cause this far right-wing Freedom Caucus to challenge the leadership of the House of the Republican McCarthy. And so McCarthy will have to decide whether he wants to give in to the demands of these right-wingers, or if he would vote with the rest of the Republican caucus and the Democrats in the House of Representatives for such a new spending bill. In the Senate, it's different. Almost all the Republican senators are supporting additional aid for Ukraine. But as we know, it's not sufficient if Senate is approving such a bill. Also, the House needs to approve such a new spending effort.
And where does Europe stand in all of this? Let's say that a Republican or even Donald Trump wins the election next year. So the support for Ukraine will go down, and I don't think that the Europeans could live with not supporting Ukraine. So they have to do it on their own. Where do we stand on efforts in this direction?
Well, that's a very dangerous scenario. If Trump wins the elections, it's most likely that support for Ukraine will go down considerably, if not totally. And if Trump wins the presidency, we will again see efforts by Donald Trump to weaken the transatlantic relationship, particularly within the framework of NATO. But if the United States stops delivering weapons or decreases the deliveries of weapons significantly, the Europeans cannot make up for it. They are not in a position to replace or to substitute for the United States in providing military hardware to Ukraine. So it would definitely mean that the Europeans would try to continue to support Ukraine, but the overall support would be very much weaker, as the Europeans, as I've said, cannot make up for deliveries of the United States that will no longer be handed over to Ukraine. So Ukraine's position in the war will be weakened. So the interest of the Ukrainian leadership, of course, is to bring the war to an end before the presidential elections, and quite the opposite. The Russian side is trying to prolong the war, hoping for a Republican victory at the presidential elections in November of next year.
One final question for today. The former Vice President of the European Union, Günther, as well as Press Secretary of NATO General Jens Stoltenberg, said in recent weeks that an end to this war will involve cessions of territory. Are these only individual opinions, or is there already a shift going on in the support of the Ukraine?
But it does indicate that the voices grow louder who say that the war should be brought to a quick end by territorial concessions on the Ukrainian side. But this is still a very minority opinion in Western governments. The Ukrainian leadership has stated publicly that it does not want to make any territorial concessions. Also, a great majority of Ukrainians don't want to see territorial concessions for peace. So the Ukrainian position is quite hard on this issue of territorial losses. If the offensive of this year will not reach at least some more moderate gains in seizing territory from the Russian side, it will definitely be the need of a further offensive by Ukraine in the mid-spring of next year. And it's not guaranteed that all Western governments actually would wait for another offensive, bring weapons to Ukraine to gauge such an offensive. And I think then the voices will be growing in numbers that some sort of truce should be achieved between the Ukrainian and the Russian armies. The pressure will grow. If it will be significant enough to force the Ukrainian government to give in and negotiate with the Russians about a ceasefire remains to be seen. But if such a ceasefire would be achieved, then what we can definitely say is that the West needs to continue to arm Ukraine significantly in order for the Ukrainian army to be able to deter a future Russian aggression against the rest of Ukraine, because a truce actually favors the Russian side. They can regroup, they can rearm, they can reorganize, and a truce could bring them into a position that allows them to go on the offensive again after a couple of years. So no, if a truce will be achieved, which is not a likely scenario, but a possible scenario, then Ukraine needs to be armed heavily so that Russia cannot start a new aggression against the rest of Ukraine in a couple of years.
Okay, then I think we'll wrap up for today. Thank you for your time and for your views on the topic, and we will see each other again. here.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.